Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. If you're watching this video, then you've likely purchased my Spyderco washer bearing upgrade kit. And before we really jump into the instructions, I want to talk just for a moment about why I think these washers dishing out has been a problem. And essentially, what I discovered, not just with my Southard, but with other Spyderco knives, especially from, or only from Taichung, it seems like, is that other than the very earliest models, they seem to vary quite a bit. I'm trying to stay in frame here. They seem to vary quite a bit as far as the distance between the scales. So this distance here and this distance here, that changes from the pivot to the back of the knife. So essentially what's happening is on almost all of these, the Southards, the Dominoes, I'm not sure about the Nirvana, but the Mantras have this issue as well, excuse me, is when your pivot is tightened to the point of no blade play, this dimension up here is too tight relative to the back of the knife. So in effect, what that's doing is your bearings in here, they go into pockets that are milled into the inside of the scale. And those pockets are at an angle. They're sort of tilted in. And essentially, I think that uneven pressure makes it where, as you're tightening this pivot and you get to the point of no blade play, since it's pinched, one side is basically over-tightened. And over time, that dishes out the washer. So my hypothesis, and I don't really have, this is just kind of my gut feeling, but I think that the knife manufacturing designer, not the knife designer, not Spyderco, not Brad Southard, but the guy probably in Taichung who was tasked with rigging everything up to mill out the parts for this, I suspect that he initially intended to use varying thickness washers with the knife. So let's say your blade stock is a little bit thin, no problem, just use washers that are 1/10 of a thou or so thicker, and it'll make up for that. Or maybe if the standoffs are too narrow, so on and so forth. You can use the washers to really make sure that you always have that perfect action. And that seems to be reflected. The early Southards do have some varying thickness washers, from what I've determined, from what I can tell. But after the first maybe 6 months of their production, it seems like they went to just this single thickness washer for the remainder of the lifetime of the knife. So basically what I did is I went and had washers made, and there was a lot of trial and error here. These are a very specific size washer. You can't find these off the shelf as far as the inside-outside diameter. They have to be hardened because these really are functioning as a bearing race, not a washer, right? So there's some material science that goes into, or went into, me coming up with these washers. So what I did is I ordered washers that are basically the thickest washer you could possibly need in a Southard. And then what we're going to do is we're going to install them as they come in my kit. And we're going to measure how thick the pivot is. And then that's going to tell us how much material we need to remove from the washer. So I'm going to show you how to do this, how to disassemble the knife and install it with my slightly too thick washers. And then we're going to measure the pivot. Am I in frame? We're going to measure the pivot up here and say, okay, it's a little too thick, and we can figure out how much material to remove. So let's go ahead and get started with this. The first thing to keep in mind is a lot of the Southards and Dominoes, especially the earlier versions, thankfully they've stopped doing this, but the earlier knives were Loctited. All of the screws have Loctite on them. And basically what you want to do is get your torque set, and you want to have a good torque set, Weha or Wera or another good brand, something that fits in the screw really well. And if you can't, let me step back here, we're only going to remove the screws on this show side of the scale. Okay, I want you to leave all of these screws alone, including that pivot screw. So you take your Torx bit and you go to remove this screw, and if you can't do it, if it takes a lot of pressure and you can't break that loose and you're worried about stripping out this screw, I want you to stop and boil up yourself a pot of water. And then what I do, or what I like to do, is I do it in sections. So I start usually with the pivot screw, is I boil up some water, and I hold it by the tail end of the knife like this, and I dunk it in the water up to about right there. and then immediately remove the knife and quickly unscrew this screw. If you wait too long, that Loctite will actually harden back up. So usually boiling water is enough to loosen up the Loctite to get the screws out. So you do one half first, and then get that screw broken loose, and then flip it around the other way and do the same thing. Pull it out of the water, immediately remove those screws, and you shouldn't have any problems getting that apart. That's the most difficult aspect to any of this. So if you're worried about this install, that is really the only concern of screwing up the knife, is stripping out these screws. If you do that, you know, I'm not sure, Spyderco, they've changed their policy, and they now have said that it's okay to disassemble your knife. If you email them, they'll probably send you some new screws. But be careful, don't strip them out in the first place, and then you don't have to worry about it. So first thing you really need to do once you get those screws broken loose is put a piece of tape on the blade. Okay, you don't want to cut yourself messing around with this kit. Okay. And then the next thing that's important here is anytime you're messing with the pivot screw, I want you to remove the tension off the lock bar. Okay, and I like to do that because it's possible to bind up the knife. Everything is under quite a bit of tension when the knife is locked up like this, so I don't want you to unscrew it and somehow get something a little bit out of whack and end up dinging up the lock face on that lock bar. So hold the lock bar open and get that pivot screw loose. I like to get everything a little bit loose in the knife before I actually remove any of the screws. Okay. And you know, I can't zoom out any further here with my setup, so you'll have to excuse how close this video is, but one thing I really like, and I love all of these Taichung bearing folders. I know, excuse me, I know some people don't have great things to say about them, but once you get this issue with the washers sorted out, they're really great knives, and they're built to very, very tight tolerances. Mine has been apart many times, so that scale just came right off. But the first time you disassemble yours, you're probably going to have to wiggle this scale around a little bit to get it off. And what I don't want you to do is pry it off. So don't pry it off like that. Try to pull it off straight up. And like I said, do a little wiggling, and that should come off no problem. And you can see here, I have my kit installed. This is the very first final version of my washers. So these washers and bearings have seen a lot of use over 30 days. Anytime I was sitting outside or sitting around at home, I'd sit there and just flip the knife open and close. My wife is so sick and tired of hearing about it, to be honest with you. So, okay, once you get your knife apart, you need to remove your blade stop pin, and I want you to clean everything out really well. Mine is pretty clean. But if you've had yours a number of years, you're going to find like gunk inside the blade stop pin pocket. I want you to clean that out. And it's also very, very important to clean inside of this, are we in frame? Yeah, clean inside this bearing pocket really, really well. I mean, you don't want any lint in there. You don't want any little residue off of your Q-tip. It needs to be absolutely spotless. It's hugely critical that this washer is resting flat inside this pocket, and there's no real way, once the washer is installed, there's no way to clean that out. So make sure you clean that out really, really, really well. And do the same thing for the show side of the scale. Remove your washer and clean out that pocket. Make sure everything is nice and clean. Again, that's in my opinion, that really is the biggest problem with these Southards and Dominoes is these bearings, most of them from the factory, don't seem to be riding on a squared up bearing pocket. So you want to make sure that's all nice and clean. You also want to avoid getting any oil or lube on your lock face here. So once you're done, take a little bit of rubbing alcohol or something and wipe that off. Okay, the next step is to take the washers just as they come out of the pack from me. And, again, make sure the back of the washer is clean, there's no grit or anything in that pocket, and just pop that washer in. Your blade stop pin. Now, I tend to keep mine oriented exactly how I removed it out of the knife. If your Southard has had a ton of use and your lockup is a little bit deep, a little bit late, you can actually take this pin and rotate it 180 degrees. Okay, and what that's going to do is over time, this pin actually wears a little tiny bit. And if you rotate it to a new side, that's going to basically cause your lockup to come in a little bit early. I'm not really concerned about lockup, so I always put it in exactly how it came. Maybe in 20 years, 30 years, I might want to rotate it around. And you can see, trying to check the camera here, you can see my washer, you can see where the bearings ride on it. And I've flipped this, I don't even know, I'd guess probably 100 or 150 times a day for a month. For about a week of that, I had the pivot over tightened quite a bit. I was really trying to just absolutely hard use this as much as possible. And even though in the video it looks, you can see like the little shiny line, there's no indentation, you can't feel it with your fingernail, and that's because these washers are fully through hardened. They're super, super, super hard. These aren't like if you go to Ace Hardware and you buy a washer. Those are designed to basically give a little bit under compression when you tighten down a bolt or screw, but that's the opposite of what we want here. So anyhow, if you disassemble your knife after using it and you see that little shiny line, that's fine. You're not going to get an actual groove or any dishing going on in that washer. So like I mentioned, we're not on this pivot, we're not going to touch this the lock side screw here. You can leave that alone. If that's Loctited in, no problem. You'll notice that this pivot has a flat face on it, and that is to prevent the pivot from moving when you loosen the screw. So some people, especially like if this isn't the first time you've disassembled your Southard, or maybe you bought it used, if people don't know to heat up the Loctite to get it loose, then they just torque out that screw. That basically transfers all the force onto the flat spot inside your scale. So if you're installing this kit and you notice a really large burr right in here, mine has a very, very small one, but it doesn't affect anything. But if you notice that, there's a large bit of raised titanium where that pivot was trying to turn, I suggest taking a small file and just kind of filing it down. It's unlikely to affect the bearings, but as you can see, everything is built to very close tolerances. So if that burr is lifted up too much, it could affect it. So glance at that while you have it apart. Okay, so now it's time for reassembly. Like I've mentioned a couple times now, you want to go ahead and install the washers as is at first, so we can figure out the dimension, or we can figure out how much material to remove. The bearings have two sides. There's an open side and there's a closed side. It technically, from a functional perspective, it doesn't really matter which way these go, but I like to install them closed side towards the blade, as I feel like that helps prevent gunk and stuff from getting inside the bearings. So then, let's see, bearing, we've got our blade stop pin, and then now we're going to, well, let me back up a second. I like to put just a drop of oil on the bearings. Okay, and I mean, I'm talking literally just a drop or two, and then I use a little bit of compressed air and just kind of spray it in there to help spread that oil around. Okay, and then reinstall the blade. And then at this point, it gets a little bit tricky. I don't think those birds are going to be quiet for my video. That's okay. At this point, it's going to be a little bit tricky because I like to, again, hold this lock bar open. I feel like where a lot of people get sort of messed up on these Southards is they have this lock bar, they leave it torqued over like that as they're tightening everything down, and it really binds up the knife. So it's a little finicky, but what I'm actually doing is I'm using my index finger to hold this pin in place. That keeps the pin from falling out, and then I use my thumb to hold the lock bar down. And then on the show side of the scale, same thing, you want to clean out that pocket, and then you put your washer in there. Sometimes it takes a little drop of grease in that show side scale or excuse me, a drop of oil on in the bearing pocket to help the washer stick to the scale. It makes it a lot easier to install this. You want to be careful not to pinch the washers as you reinstall this. If you do, send me an email and I'll send you out another washer for free. But it's just something to pay attention to. You want to, like I said, you want to make sure you don't pinch anything up. Okay, so again, I'm holding that pivot up with my index finger, and I'm holding the lock open with my thumb. You don't have to leave the screws in the scale like I've done, but basically while you're holding that lock open, you just kind of push the scale on and you'll feel it pop into place. Again, these things are built to super close tolerances. You'll know when that scale is on. So at this point, I let go of the lock bar just for now as I basically just barely snug up these screws. I'm not tightening anything down totally, and I'm just getting everything screwed in so nothing falls apart. You want to make sure you reinstall it. Well, you don't have to reinstall the lanyard tube, but the lanyard tube only goes in one way, so pay attention to that when you're reinstalling. And then I like to tighten these 3 scale screws first. I tighten the pivot last. I feel like that helps keep the knife square. Again, I'm even doing this, I'm holding that lock bar open. This isn't something I've really read much about, this holding the lock bar open. Most people, they don't do it, and you know, I don't know, maybe I'm being a little too OCD, but I do feel like that seems to help quite a bit with centering. The Southard doesn't have a lock bar steel insert, so I feel like it is possible to definitely tighten this up. There's a lot of forces going on in here when you're tightening these screws, and you just don't want to mar up that lock face. So, okay, at this point we've got our bearings, our washers installed, just a drop or two of grease on the washers. We've got these 3 scale screws tightened up. Excuse me. Now I want to talk about really the very most important part of this install, and that is your pivot tension. And even with my washers, it's probably possible to over tighten this pivot and dish them out. So basically what you're doing here is you're going to tighten this pivot to the point of no blade play, but no further. And it's probably not going to show, oh, maybe it shows up a little bit on camera here, but you can feel it. You know, you take the tension off the lock bar and you're moving that blade side to side like this, and you can feel that there's a little bit of play in there. And you tighten it up a little bit, and we're talking like a degree or 2 at a time. You know, at this point there's no blade play, so I'm actually going to back it up just a tiny bit. I've got a little bit of blade play, so I'm going to push it forward just a little bit, and this is, I mean, we're talking maybe a ½ a degree of rotation here. It's so minute. It's all done by feel. And when you're at this point of the install, you'll see exactly what I mean as far as being able to feel that little bit of blade play. So at this point, we're good to go here. I'll try to get this tape out of the way and I can test function. It's perfectly centered. Perfect. Can't do an action test on camera. This camera is so close here, but anyhow. So at this point, this assumes that you have you've installed my washers as they come from the factory. So the next thing to check is that measurement we just discussed before. What we're gonna do is use a set of digital calipers. Most of the tolerances here are in inches. Line frame, okay, and most Southards are 197th of an inch thick, so 0.197 thick at the back of the knife. See that? It's 0.197. So ideally, your space at the front of the knife is going to be pretty much 0.197. And mine is 1 thou off, but that's super, super close, and that's fine. That's not close enough to make it worth trying to remove any more material. However, let's say, so you measure the back of your knife here and it's 0.197, and then you measure the front of the knife and it's, I don't know, let's say 0.207. Okay, so let's say on your knife you go to measure this pivot end and it's 0.207 versus 0.197 back here. Okay, so that means you would be 1/10 of a thou off. Does that make sense? So 0.197 on the back, 0.207 on the front. That means we're 0.010 too thick on this pivot area of the knife. So what you do is you take that 0.010, you divide that in half, and you'd get 0.005. And that means each washer is 0.005 too thick. And what you do is you take a piece of sandpaper, you want to put it on a very flat surface, a piece of glass or maybe a ceramic tile, and I start with 220 grit sandpaper. Again, being fully through hardened, these things are just extremely hard pieces of steel, and it can take about 10 or 15 minutes per washer to remove 5/1000ths of an inch from it. But I start with 220, and you want to go in a figure 8 motion like this. And you just keep going, keep going. It doesn't take a lot of pressure. You don't need to push hard enough to sand your fingertip through the center of the washer. You just kind of, it's almost like sharpening a knife. You just take your time and keep going. And then take your washer, rotate it 90 degrees, and then keep going. Another couple minutes. Take the washer, rotate it 90 degrees, and keep doing your figure 8s. You only want to sand one side of the washer. Okay, the sanded side of the washer goes towards the bearing pocket. You want this factory fresh surface of this washer to be against the bearings. And what you do is you keep removing that material, and every couple minutes you take your washer and your digital calipers and you see the thickness. My washers are about 0.010 thick out of the box. Most people have to remove 2 to 3/1000ths of an inch. So as you start sanding, it'll go from 0.010 to 0.009, and then 0.008, and then 0.007, and so on and so forth. The factory washers are 0.005. So the factory washers are half as thick as the washers I'm sending you. You really don't want to sand them any thinner than that. If you have to sand them thinner than 0.005, then there might be something else going on with your knife. And definitely email me. If you're doing this kit and these instructions don't work, you might have one of the oddball knives that don't match the tolerances of the other ones, and I'd really like to know. So if you have any issues, send me an email and I'll definitely help you. So anyhow, you measure, you sand down the material off the back of the washer, and then take the knife back apart and reinstall them, and then test it again. And like I said, you want to end up with the front within a couple thousandths of the back. It doesn't have to be perfect. Even 2 or 3 thousandths off is perfectly fine. And I suggest if your washers are a little too thick, that seems to be fine. I'd rather go with a washer that's slightly too thick than too thin. So, okay, that really sums up this video. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to send me an email. If you have any trouble installing the kit, let me know. If the kit doesn't fit your knife, let me know. You can send it back to me and I'll give you a full refund. So, all right, thanks for watching.